Hello again, everyone. I'm Carolyn Cumsty-Fowler, and thank you for joining us in this leadership development series. The content I'm going to present to you today is called Discovering the Power of Evaluative Thinking. And the cohort graduates may think, now this is strange, I don't think we ever had a formal session with this title. And that's true, we didn't. The content that I'm going to share with you is pieces of content that was sort of put throughout the work that we did together. We had a lot of sessions where we asked these questions. These slides will be familiar to the facilitators. We often had a lot of this interaction and these kinds of questioning blitzes in our practice sessions. And so as I was thinking about how best to present this, I decided to pull those threads together and put them into one module so that you could access them. And evaluative thinking is an unbelievably powerful skill set, and that's why I wanted you to have access to it. True or false? And I'm going to ask you to just actually say this to each other in the room. I won't hear it, but you can actually answer this question. Failure is the opportunity to begin again, only more intelligently. True, false? This is false. If our program's evaluation is either inadequate or not relevant or usable. And you may be saying, well, I'm not here to talk about evaluation. And I'm going to ask you just to humor me and spend some time with me while I talk to you about the way I think about evaluation, which is very different than the way that we historically have thought about evaluation. So let's just talk for a moment about the importance of adequate and relevant program evaluation. So typically in any program, we have planning for the program, we have the way we implement the program, and then we have the outcomes, what it is we hope to change, the difference we want to make. And so for many of you, the outcomes are about the compliance and what that means for people in the care of the facilities that you regulate. Historically, though, the outcomes evaluation is something that people have always said is the most important. And I'm not saying that it isn't important. It is important. However, if all I do is monitor my outcomes, then even if I get information, my ability to change at that point is limited. I've already done it. And so potentially you could say, well, that's okay. We'll change it better. We'll change it next time. We'll improve it next time. But if all I have is outcome evaluation, with what information? You see that big black arrow with all the question marks in it? With what information am I going to improve my program? Because if I haven't collected information about how I plan my program, the decisions I make about my program, how I implement my program, how I train my people to implement the program, if I don't have information about that, then I cannot use what I learn or have learned to start again more intelligently. I just can't do it. And so we're going to talk today about how we use specifically evaluative thinking to put us in a position where we have the answers to these questions that we need to ask. How do we make evaluation more adequate, useful, and usable? If it's not usable, why are you doing it? And so what I'm going to recommend is that instead of thinking about this traditional evaluation where you design something, you do it, you say, did it work? It's really sort of a more judgment or measurement-based evaluation approach. I'm going to really advocate that you try as much as possible to adopt a real-world and utilization-focused approach. Utilization focus means it's designed to be used. It's kind of a radical concept, don't you think? So real-world evaluation becomes more adequate, it becomes more relevant, and it becomes more utilization-focused and usable when we do several things. The first thing is we have to change what we think about evaluation's role in our work. So evaluation is not there to judge us, it's not there to find fault, it's there to inform us. And then we have to think about when we start thinking about using evaluation. So not at the end of a program, but we need to start thinking about evaluation right up front. And once again, Einstein has another of his quotes, which is we can't solve our problems with the same thinking that we used when we created them. So, very often we've thought about what it is we want to do, and when we find out it's not working, we're going to have to come back and ask a different set of questions if we want to find some solutions. So if we think about The what then? The what of evaluation is to help us learn about and inform our programs, right from the identification of the problem or the challenge we want to address, the analysis of that, the design of the program or the response, the delivery of the program or the QI response, and then the intended outcome. And then the when is learning about and informing our programs from the very beginning and continuing throughout the life of the program. But wait, there's more. Let's do the infomercial thing. In addition to knowing about that linear process from problem identification through intended outcome, we also need to ask ourselves some questions about the context in which this work has to happen. And this is something that I think is very important to you at OHCQ. Because even if you are a regulatory agency and you are all doing regulatory work and you are all working with healthcare organizations, the context is different. The federal programs have a different context than the state programs. And when you're working with developmental disabilities, that's different than when you're working with the elderly and long-term care. And also remember that the context in which we practice changes as administrations change, as funding changes, as regulation changes, context changes. And so we need to keep asking ourselves questions about what is the context in which we have to do the work that we do. I apologize that it's going to be hard to read the contextual factors because of that rainbow behind them, and that was intentional on my part. I put the rainbow there because I want to convey to you that context is diverse, it's multifactorial, it's about a lot of different things. So in a context, you can have things like physical environmental factors. And now let me just pause for a second and say, as you go out to inspect facilities and you're trying to think about, well, why are some people more able to comply and some people aren't able to comply, you might realize that in fact maybe there are some physical environmental factors that are at play here. Then we have behavioral factors in context, and those are contextually and sometimes culturally influenced. So the way that I may choose to behave in an informal setting with my family and colleagues is different than the way I'm going to behave when I'm inspecting a facility, because there are certain things I may or may not do according to that policy. And so understanding the behavioral factors that have to be at play is really important. Also, understanding culture is really important too. And then we have a set of social environmental factors, or social ecological factors. And these could be things like the culture, the law, the policies, the regulations, the protocols, all of those things. And those are sort of the official things we know about a social environment. So if I want to understand, how do we work in this program, or what's the philosophy of this organization, there are some official things that we know. The question, though, is, does that truly represent the social environment in which we find ourselves? Because then you'll find that there are also informal factors. They may be explicitly stated. So these are the culture, norms, the beliefs, the ways of doing. So there are ways of doing and working at OHCQ that are the ways you do business. Some of those are controlled or informed by the official policies and protocols, and some of them are just the way you decide to function. And this will be important like in your teamwork. So you're not going to have a lot of protocols necessarily telling you how you interact as a team, but if your norm is that, I have an open door policy and that I expect people to always bring their concern to the person directly as opposed to gossip with somebody else, that can become part of your informal culture. And then, and this is the most troubling, that in every context, we have what we call the tacit factors. And these are factors that are influencing the social environment, but they are deliberately unspoken or unconsciously unspoken. So sometimes people's dissatisfaction, people's concern, people's feeling of maybe not feeling safe emotionally or even physically, those either they don't want to say anything because they think that there'll be a problem if they speak up, but sometimes they just don't even have the words to use. They don't know what it is. Something's bothering them, but they don't know what it is. And this is a challenge because as leaders, we need to understand that it is our role not to pry, but it is our role to create a safe space in which people can speak and tell us what's going on. The other thing that we need to respect is the influence of the history. So I have my change process, which is where we hope to be. We're starting with where we are. We have this context around us, and we have to understand that every context has a history. And so if I'm trying to understand why we're in a position of that we're in and how to move it forward, we need to also ask some questions about how do we get here? Because sometimes we have a very positive history and something's changed and now we need to try and recapture that. But sometimes there may be a negative history that we need to be aware of. So say, for example, we have colleagues that we're working with or people that we're leading and supervising. And we're trying to go to a place where we ask learner questions, we're supportive, we ask people to share their opinions and be part of the solution. We honor their skill and their experience. But maybe they've come from a place where that was punished before, or they were never allowed to speak up, or if they spoke up, they got marginalized or discounted or fired. Then that person's carrying a history, right? So that history can make it more or less likely that they are going to be able to embrace this new way of working as a team. So be sensitive to the fact that there's always a history to an issue. Now, what else? We've got the process, we've got the context, we've got the history. What else do we need to think about as we work in our programs? Yes? Resources, right? Resources. What are the resources that we have to do the work that we do? And once again, we're asking questions about what are the resources? What are the resources that we have internally? Whether that's internal to our program or internal to OHCQ. You may also be asking questions about the people that you're working with. What are their internal resources? But we also want to think about external resources, and this is something that I've noticed that just often does not get asked. So we have our budgets in our programs, but say, for example, I'm struggling to deal with an issue of how do I hold people accountable? And I'm not very good at it, and I don't feel like I have someone in my team who's really skilled at it. Maybe I could look around outside of my program at OHCQ and say, do we have colleagues here who just seem to be able to do that in a way that's not only effective, but it's respectful, it lands well, it doesn't cause trouble. Maybe that would be a way of reaching out to somebody else and tapping into their expertise as a resource. And this is something that we found happening with the leadership development cohort, that their act of learning together also helped them appreciate the many gifts that each person brought to the table. So when we think about resources, please don't just think about the funding and the infrastructure, but also think about our capacity to do the work, our capacity to bring ourselves to the work, and remember that relationships are the ultimate resource mobilizers. Then as we ask evaluation questions, so often when we ask questions, we're asking questions that are sort of negative, like, oh, so what didn't work, and what don't we have, and what went wrong, and how will the next patient be harmed, all those sorts of questions. I'm not suggesting they shouldn't be asked, they should be asked, but we need to balance them. So when we have a lot of deficits-focused questions that are about what's not happening well, what's going wrong, then obviously it just completely pushes down our ability to identify assets and opportunities that we could use in our work. When we learn to ask these assets questions, so who are the resources we could use? How could we use our time more effectively so that we're able to accomplish whatever it is we need to accomplish? Who has that strength or that skill that we could deploy? Then as we intentionally ask assets-based questions or assets-focused questions, you will see that your ability to identify opportunities for growth and improvement will go up. Now, I have another irritating backdrop to this program cycle, and this is a light spectrum. This is a picture of the light spectrum. And I use this as an analogy for the kind of evaluation I'm talking about. That's the kind of evaluation which occurs in many, 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 many slices. So I'm asking questions all the time about the work we do, why we're doing it, how we're doing it, what's the impact it's making. Because that's when you shed light on your program. And it's very important because this kind of rapid slice evaluation or monitoring is flexible. If you think about a slinky, it's got lots and lots of slices and it's flexible. I can move it. And this is very important when we work in rapidly changing and complex conditions. And so we have to prioritize as a team using these adaptable, multi-layered evaluation strategies where we just get into the habit of asking lots of questions. And I try to always recommend that we look for rigorous approaches to how we evaluate our programs as opposed to rigid approaches. And I'm going to introduce you just to two very quickly. And the first is Michael Quinn Patton's developmental evaluation. And I'm not asking you to learn it or to read this book or even to become expert at it, but I want to share with you the principle. And as I read this to you, think about whether this is sounding familiar to you. So developmental evaluation offers a process for periodic reflection, systematically looking back and seriously looking ahead to gauge progress, harvest important lessons, and rigorously examine what's working and what's not. Developmental evaluation supports standing still as a foundation for the next move forward. And then he's not suggesting standing still for a month, but he's suggesting this pause, which is that we constantly are saying, is this working for us? Is this not working for us? And being really reflective. I think some of these themes are things we've heard before in this series. The other person I want to introduce you to is Amy Edmondson from the Harvard Business School, and she's written a book called Teaming and another one called Teaming for Innovation. And she has a concept that she calls execution as learning. And she obviously says that you don't get this kind of approach if you haven't built relationships and trust in your team. So that has to happen first. But what it is a way of operating that allows organizations to learn as they go. Whether it's your team, your organization, or your group, it's allowing you to improvise and it's allowing you to innovate while at the same time successfully doing what it is you're supposed to be delivering. And the main thing I want you to take away here is that it's a way of operating that is deliberately and consciously iterative, where action and reflection go hand in hand. Now, you're not acting and reflecting at the same time, because if I'm reflecting, I may not be acting, but it's act, reflect, act, reflect, act, reflect. Now, this is important because when we're doing this, we're removing that fear of failure. We're saying, you know what, I'm now changing what I think, because evaluation is not being done to judge. This execution as learning is providing an opportunity for me to learn, and I'm doing it through every part of the implementation process. But now we get to the third change that we need, and that is changing how we think. And we're going to discover together the power of evaluative thinking. And I'm going to call that ET. I'm not talking about extraterrestrials. I'm talking about evaluative thinking. And this is one of the most powerful ways of learning to think, because it'll change the way you think about evaluation. It'll change the way you do evaluation. But more importantly, it changes the way we think in general. Michael Quinn Patton, who, as I just mentioned, developed developmental evaluation and also utilization-focused evaluation, writes a lot about evaluative thinking. And what he says is that evaluative thinking includes a willingness to do reality testing, to ask the question, how do we know what we think we know? How do we surface our assumptions and check them? It also requires a willingness to use data to inform decisions, not drive them, inform them. Not to make data the only basis of decisions, but to bring data to bear on decisions. And remember, data in this case are not just numbers. They could also be answers to questions and insights. Evaluative thinking is not just limited to evaluation projects. It's not even limited to formal evaluation. It's an analytical way of thinking that infuses everything that goes on. So it's not evaluation as usual. it's a way of doing business, right? So evaluation is something we do. Evaluative thinking is a way of doing it differently. In fact, when I become an evaluative thinker, it's a way of being for me. I approach everything with questions. But what he's saying is that the absolute antithesis of evaluative thinking is just check it off compliance. Because if I check it off, I'm like, it's done, 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 but I'm not asking those questions that Amy Edmondson says we should be asking, which is executioner's learning. So I can say it's done. If I then pause to say, did it go well? Is there a different way we could do it? How much did it take? Enough time? Did we take too much time? The constant act of just checking as I'm working brings me into this evaluative space. However, it's not easy. It's a practice. And as I've said once before, we don't learn from experience, we learn from reflecting on experience. And so what I'm going to suggest is that we just press pause for a moment. Let me set this up and then have you stop the video and have a conversation about this. How and why could using this reflective evaluation, where we just get used to asking lots of questions about everything, how could that reduce evaluation anxiety and improve our program delivery and effectiveness? When you've had that conversation, I'll be here. So what I hope that you discovered in that conversation is that when we begin to embed evaluative thinking, the judgment gets taken out of the space. And we make some very important shifts. And the shifts we make in the work and the way that we work together is that we move from having our evaluation work be about judging to learning. We move from wanting to have a certain answer and a certain metric to being more curious about how we can do it even better or do it more efficiently. We move from the idea that if we don't get it right, we've failed, to the idea that, well, it's not where it needs to be yet, and what do we need to do to get it to where it needs to be? It moves us from thinking about challenges as a problem and a deficit to an opportunity for improvement and growth. It moves us from being purely risk-focused, like this could go wrong, this could go wrong, this could go wrong, to being strengths-based. Because remember, if I'm learning about why things are going well, I'm learning about my strength and our strength. And most importantly, it moves us as a team from a fixed mindset team to an open mindset team. Now this is a strange but true reality. So many of you by now may be thinking, oh, good grief. This is too complicated. I could never do this. I don't have the time to learn it or to practice this. And what I'm going to say to you is this. If you did not already practice evaluative thinking every day, you could not be an effective human being. Everything we do in our personal lives, we're saying, did that work? Did I leave enough time for that? If I need this done, who are my best people? If I need to do X, how much sleep do I need the night before? We are all constantly in our daily lives asking ourselves these questions. We don't go back to a restaurant the second time if it wasn't good because we're like, well, was it worth the money? No, probably not, right? So we're very good at this in our personal life, but somehow there's this disconnect between what we're already very good at and what we do at work. And so I'm not saying this to judge. I'm saying this just to notice. Notice how much you use this kind of evaluative thinking in your daily life and try to bring it into the work that you do at OHCQ. So reflecting on experience is not intuitive. It's got to be learned. It's got to be practiced, and it requires these things. It requires humility, it requires an openness to possibility, It requires an opportunity to learn from experienced evaluative thinkers, and so you'll know who they are. As you look for the people who ask lots of learner questions, you're going to see who they are. And often people who ask a lot of learner questions are also more experienced evaluative thinkers. So find them and work with them. It requires a willingness to practice, and it requires a willingness to keep practicing. So it's not easy, but it doesn't cost money, and actually, I promise you, it doesn't take more time. When we actually start practicing it, it ultimately will save us some time. So then what would you see if you had embedded evaluative thinking in OHCQ? What we know from the literature is that you see and hear people posing really thoughtful questions. You see them describing and sometimes illustrating their thinking. So sometimes if something's not immediately obvious verbally, you'll see people drawing pictures, diagrams, illustrating ideas. You'll find that people are actively engaged in finding understanding. They are very willing to consider different alternatives. So even if you have very strict mandates in terms of what you do in the field, there may be alternatives for how you work as a team inside, or alternatives in terms of how you capture your information or how you retrieve information. And so they're open to this. And people believe in the value of evaluation. They don't think of it as a judgment or a threat. What you'll also see is creativity. Creativity is a hallmark of evaluative thinking. You see much more evidence gathering and much more evidence sharing. We see lots more feedback going in all directions. You see many more reflective conversations among whether it's just the staff, the leadership, or even the people who you're serving. Many more diagrams and models. You see programs evolving. So you see people improving quality, improving ways of approaching things, improving ways of doing things. You see that the effectiveness of the staff and the programs goes up, and you also, and this is important for OHCQ, see greater field staff influence over project decisions. Now, we have to be careful about what's feasible and what's not feasible about OHCQ. But very often, the people who are right in the field have insights about how potentially we could do things better than we're doing them. Or, if we're doing them well, how we sustain that. And these are some questions. I'm not going to read these questions to you, but you will hear this kind of question being asked. And a lot of perspective taking, a lot of curiosity, a lot of clarification that's going on here. So now I'm going to ask you to go back into a conversation. We're approaching the end of what I'm going to say to you, but I want you to first think about this individually and then talk to each other as a group. There are lots of things that you think you know about your program, the work you do, the people with whom you work, and what a good outcome would look like. I want you to challenge yourself for a moment and say, how do I know what I think I know about this? How did I learn this? Where did this come from? And are any unasked questions coming to mind? Are there questions that I now have about my work that would help me understand sort of why I'm doing it, or how I could do it better, or how I could support the people that I supervise? And when you've finished with this conversation, I'll be here. We're at the end now. We're coming right to the end of what I have to say to you. But how do we start using evaluative thinking in our work? If your program is intrigued by this and you want to say, look, as a team, we want to commit to using evaluative thinking, how do you do it? Well, firstly, commit to doing it. And then be clear as a group about why you're beginning this journey. What's in it for you? What do you think that you'll gain by practicing evaluative thinking? Remember, it's a journey, not a race, so don't judge yourself about the fact it's hard or you don't get it quickly. But commit in the same way we commit to noticing learner and judger questions, commit to noticing evaluative thinking in action. And one of the ways that I do this is if I'm working with somebody who asks a really fabulous question that has everybody thinking differently about something, I'll make a point of expressing appreciation to them for that and say something like, Patty, when you asked that question, it sort of opened up the conversation in a really new and exciting way. And then notice how evaluative thinking improves your decision making and your professional interactions. The road to embedding evaluative thinking in any team or organization is tough because we're going against our normal patterns and our normal behaviors. But let's consider the alternative. Without this kind of reflection and without this evaluative thinking, we go blindly on our way, creating more unintended consequences and failing to achieve anything useful. I have absolute confidence that you can do this, and I hope that it makes a huge difference for you.